Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to hit subscribe and give this video a like. It helps more than you might think. In 1978, two investigative reporters from Los Angeles heard about a story that was not only bizarre, but also almost unbelievable. They embarked on a month-long journey to track down its source, leading them to an old, run-down cabin in the middle of the Mojave Desert. There, they were told the most frightening tale of their lives. John Adamson opened the door to the cabin and invited them inside. When they asked about what had happened, he began his story. "I haven't told this story to anyone in a very long time, as it brings back painful memories. I suppose I can tell it one more time before I die. Since I'm quite old now, I've always believed that the world is divided between the ordinary and the extraordinary. My life fell neatly into the former category until the autumn of 1934. The morning of my daughter's 15th birthday is a day I'll never forget. I awoke with a mix of excitement and nervousness. My daughter Mary had grown to look just like her mother, my wife, who had passed away a few years before. That loss still remains a painful memory. That morning, I had carefully wrapped a new dress for her, hoping it would make her smile. As I handed it to her, I watched her closely, but her expression remained blank. I felt a pang of disappointment, so I gently asked her what was wrong. She hesitated but told me there was nothing wrong. Yet, from the look on her face, I knew she was lying. Mary had a way of hiding her feelings, making her hard to read, but I didn't want to let her special day pass without understanding what she truly wanted. So, I pressed on. After a while, she finally decided to give in, but her words weren't exactly what I had been expecting. She said, "Mama promised to take me hiking when I turned 15, but now—" Her voice trailed off, a hint of sadness in her tone. "Never mind," she whispered, shaking her head slightly before turning and walking away. My heart ached for her. I knew how much she loved her mother and how much she missed her. Hiking wasn't my idea of fun, but I would do anything to see her smile again. I went to her room, determined to cheer her up. "How about we go hiking together?" I suggested, trying to sound enthusiastic. Her eyes lit up and a wide grin spread across her face. "Really?" she asked. "Really," I replied, trying to hide the surprise at my boldness. "We'll pack up and spend the weekend in the woods." I still remember how she jumped up and hugged me tightly. As I held her, I realized that sometimes the best way to honor the memory of a loved one is to create new memories with those who are still here. So, we set to begin our hike next weekend. The next day, I was absorbed in my book, the world outside fading away. Then, suddenly, the silence was broken by Mary rushing in, her excitement palpable as she unrolled the map in front of me. She pointed to a part of it, saying that it was where she wanted us to begin our hike. "We're going to the Black Forest!" she exclaimed, her eyes shining with excitement. I raised an eyebrow as a frown creased my forehead. I hadn't been to the Black Forest before, so I didn't know much about it. Although I had heard whispers that it was a place where shadows seemed to dance under the moonlight and strange, eerie noises echoed through the trees. It wasn't the kind of place I'd usually pick for a vacation. "The Black Forest?" I questioned. "Why there, of all places?" "Oh, Dad, it'll be so much fun," she insisted. "All my friends have been there, and they've told me amazing stories. We'll hike, camp, and explore. It'll be an adventure." I sighed. I knew better than to argue with her. She was determined, and her happiness was my priority. I couldn't deny this, so I agreed. As I began packing, my mind kept returning to the Black Forest. The bears, wolves, and unknown creatures of the night that might be lurking in the shadows. Not to mention the unpredictable weather that could turn our trip into something much more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. But I pushed these fears aside. After all, it was just a few days. What could possibly go wrong? It was a Saturday afternoon when we headed into the Black Forest for a hike. By the time we set off, the sun was already high in the sky. We followed the trail for roughly 5 miles before turning off and heading in the direction of the river. As we chatted and laughed about a variety of topics, the 5-mile hike on the trail passed quickly. Things only started to change after we left the path. For some reason, The chatter faded as soon as we stepped off the trail. It was as if we had both suddenly lost interest in talking, an odd shift that made the air feel heavier. Until we reached the river, the only conversation we had was about which way to go. When we arrived later that afternoon, I remember Mary saying that the river's location looked like one of Mother's paintings. We found a small clearing, a perfect spot to set up camp. We pitched the tent, unrolled the sleeping bags, and laid out a blanket as the sun began to set. For once, I was glad to be there, sharing the adventure with my daughter. Just as night fell, the forest came alive. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the rustling of leaves and the distant hooting of an owl. Suddenly I heard a soft scratching sound, like claws against bark, or something moving through the undergrowth. I opened my eyes, straining to see in the darkness, but Mary was still fast asleep. The sound was faint but persistent, and for a moment, I wondered if it was just the wind. Shrugging off the strange noise, I closed my eyes and drifted back to sleep. The following day, we packed up camp and continued our hike. The forest was beautiful with tall trees and clear streams, but as the day wore on, Mary complained that she was hungry. I reached into the backpack for a snack, but it was empty. I rechecked the bag, and then again. The food was gone. There was no way it could have just vanished. Could someone have stolen it? I racked my brain trying to remember anything unusual. Then it hit me, the strange noise I had heard the night before. Could it have been an animal? A bear, perhaps? Or maybe a raccoon drawn by the smell of food? I just couldn't place it. The food shortage wasn't good for us. I knew we needed to cut our hike short, but I hated the thought of disappointing her. When I broke the news to Mary, she didn't quite like the idea. "We can go a few more days with the little food we have," she said, her voice firm, as though trying to convince herself. She had this idea that we'd find more food along the way, but I didn't see how. I didn't want to crush her optimism, though. If she was positive, then I needed to be strong for her. Night fell again, and we found a suitable spot to set up camp. As usual, the night was filled with strange noises. I awoke suddenly to a loud crack, sharp and echoing through the darkness. My heart raced, thudding in my ears. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped cautiously out of the tent, my breath visible in the cold air. The beams swept across the forest floor, scanning every shadow, but there was nothing. As I turned to return to the tent, my eyes fell on it, open. I had been certain I'd closed it before leaving. Was it just the wind or something more? I didn't know. The constant feeling of being watched made me feel uneasy, so the following day, I told Mary that we should head back. She protested, but I promised we'd go on more trips if we headed home. After a moment's hesitation, she reluctantly agreed. As we packed up, I realized something was missing. The map, our only guide through the wilderness, was nowhere to be found. We searched everywhere, but it had vanished, just like the food. It didn't make sense, but I couldn't let Mary see how worried I was. I tried to stay calm and told her I knew the way back, though, in reality, I had no clue. We began retracing our steps, moving through the forest the way we had come. Maybe, I thought, we could find a familiar landmark. We had been walking for an hour when Mary spotted something odd. "Daddy, look," she called from a few paces ahead. Her voice carried an uneasy tone. Lying in the middle of a small clearing, almost unnaturally still, was a large burlap sack. The rope tying it shut had frayed, as if it had been abandoned there for years. It didn't belong, not out there, in the heart of the forest where everything is supposed to be untouched by human hands. I knelt beside it, my fingers trembling as they traced the rough fabric. I hesitated, feeling the weight of something wrong. "We shouldn't touch it," I whispered, suddenly feeling like we had crossed into forbidden territory. But Mary's eyes, wide and searching, were fixed on the sack. She was waiting for me to do something, to be the adult, the protector. Against my better judgment, I pulled at the loose end of the rope, untying the knot with deliberate slowness. As the mouth of the sack opened, a sickening stench filled the air. It was overpowering, the kind of smell that made your throat close and your stomach churn. "Stay back," I said, though my voice was strained, and I wasn't sure if I was giving the command to her or myself. Inside, Barely visible beneath the dirty burlap was something wrapped in plastic. A vague shape, unidentifiable at first, but then I saw it. An unmistakable human hand pressed against the inside of the transparent film. I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat. There was no mistaking what it was. Mary took a tentative step closer, her face twisting in horror as she caught a glimpse of what lay inside. "What is it, Daddy?" Her voice trembled. "We need to leave," I said, standing up too quickly, feeling the rush of adrenaline turn my legs weak. "We need to go now." But as we turned to head back to the trail, I heard something. A soft rustling sound, like leaves scraping against the ground. It was faint, barely audible over the pounding of my heart, but it was there. I glanced back at the sack, now eerily still, as though it had never moved at all. The plastic-wrapped body was motionless, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My skin crawled as if unseen eyes were following our every move. We started walking faster now, and the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew taller, the path darker, and the air heavier with every step. It was as though the woods themselves had shifted. I tried to keep calm for Mary's sake, but every sound made me jump. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I glimpsed something moving in the distance. A dark figure, visible through the trees, stood there. "Did you see that?" Mary whispered, clutching my hand tightly. "I don't know," I lied, but I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. We hurried down the path, our footsteps hurried and uneven. The sound of rustling followed us, growing louder and closer. I could hear it now. Footsteps. Someone, or something, was behind us. I turned my head again just for a second, but the figure was gone. My heart raced faster. This wasn't just our imagination. Someone was out there. We reached a fork in the trail, and we took the path less traveled. Mary and I were practically running by this point. The forest was closing in, and the sky darkened too quickly for it to still be afternoon. Suddenly I tripped. My foot caught on something, sending me tumbling to the ground. Mary screamed as she tried to help me up. I looked back and saw what had caused me to fall, another sack, identical to the first one. I froze, staring at it. This wasn't possible. We had been walking away from the clearing, away from the body, yet here it was again. The same worn burlap, the same knot, the same sinister feeling. My mind raced. Were we walking in circles? Was something or someone playing with us? "Daddy, we have to go!" Mary's voice broke through my paralysis. She was crying now, her small hands trembling as she pulled at my sleeve. I stumbled to my feet, pulling her along with me. We ran faster than before. The sound of our panicked breaths was the only thing I could hear. But the rustling, the footsteps, they never stopped. We reached another clearing, this one wider and more open. In the middle, bathed in the fading daylight, stood a man. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could see the glint of something metallic in his hand. A knife. Mary whimpered beside me, and I could feel my terror rising to the surface. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching us with an eerie stillness that made my blood run cold. I backed away slowly, pulling Mary behind me. The man's eyes never left us, though his expression was hidden in the growing darkness. For a moment we stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The man was tall and gaunt, with a long, flowing beard. His eyes, piercing and intense, seemed to bore into our souls. Fear gripped me. Then he said something I hadn't expected him to say. "Lost, are you?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "We're trying to find our way out." The man nodded slowly. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, his voice filled with an ominous sense of authority. "Few people venture into these woods. They say it's cursed." I didn't need him to tell me that. When I asked him what he was doing here, he said he always came to that part of the woods to hunt. He offered to lead us to his cabin, saying it was nearby. We followed him. The cabin was small and rustic, but it offered shelter. Its warmth and coziness reminded me of home and how much I missed it. The man insisted on feeding us, but all I wanted was a map so we could find our way home. Mary looked pale. Her lips had already become dry and chapped. We hadn't had anything substantial to eat or drink in days. I knew that if we wanted to survive, we needed to eat something, so I agreed. He served a bowl of soup and some bread. As we ate, I noticed how much he watched Mary. His eyes kept darting toward her. I tried to dismiss the feeling as paranoia, but a nagging doubt persisted. Later that night, I woke up with the sudden urge to use the loo, but there was none around. I slipped out of the cabin, relieved to be alone with my thoughts. As I returned, a chill ran down my spine. The door to the room where Mary was sleeping was slightly ajar. I crept closer, wondering if she had woken up. But then, the man emerged from the room with an unnerving smile on his lips. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he walked away and disappeared into his room. I rushed into Mary's room and found her sleeping peacefully. I was relieved, but that feeling was short-lived. The incident had shaken me to my core. Questions raced through my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. I knew I had to get my daughter out of there, and fast. I had no idea how. The forest was vast, and we were lost and vulnerable. The following day, Mary walked up to me and handed me a cup of tea and a folded map. I took the map and examined it closely. It was a detailed map of the forest, marking trails and landmarks. Then she told me it was the strange man who had asked her to give it to me. This surprised me, because I didn't like how close she had become to him. It felt wrong. I told her to gather our things. We were heading back home as soon as possible. Mary nodded and walked back to the room where our belongings were. I sipped the tea slowly as I studied the map. Just then, a bewildering drowsiness overcame me. Before I knew it, I was drifting off into a deep sleep. I didn't know how long I had been out, but when I opened my eyes, a sharp pain throbbed in my head. I sat up, disoriented and confused. The cabin was empty. No sign of the strange man or my daughter. I rushed outside, calling her name, but the forest was eerily silent. I searched for days but found nothing. With the help of the map, I managed to find my way out of the forest. I made my way to the nearest police station where I reported everything that had happened, including the bodies we'd found in the sacks earlier. When the police came out the following day, they found nothing. No sign of Mary, no trace of the man, no bodies in the sacks. The forest seemed to have swallowed it all, as if protecting a secret. They searched for a month, but still found nothing. It was as though they had vanished into thin air, and they eventually closed the case. John returned home a broken man. Every corner, every room was filled with memories of his daughter. He would often sit by the window, gazing into the distance, hoping that one day she would return to him. The photograph of Mary still rested on the mantel, its edges worn with time. Each morning he would reach for it, his fingers brushing the glass as if touching it could somehow bring her back. But it never did. You've made it, for now. Thank you for joining on this horrifying journey. If you want more, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and to follow on other platforms. There are many more stories to come, and if you enjoyed this, please like the video. It really helps. Let me know your favorite part or any suggestions in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe, if you can.